last lessons of Miss Vesper. The June heat pressed against the windows of Roosevelt Middle School like an unwelcome visitor, thick and suffocating. Inside room 214, 3 seventh graders, David, Matt, and Luke, slouched at their desks, waiting for class to begin. It was the second to last week of school, and the promise of summer vacation hung in the air like a sweet, distant dream. David drummed his pencil against his notebook, creating a rhythmic pattern that matched his anticipation. Matt doodled elaborate comic book characters in the margins of his math homework, while Luke stared at the clock, willing its hands to move faster. The classroom buzzed with the lazy energy of students who had already mentally checked out for the summer. Then, without warning, everything changed. A cold chill swept through the classroom, cutting through the oppressive heat like a knife through butter. The temperature dropped so suddenly that goosebumps erupted on every arm, and several students gasped audibly. The 3 boys exchanged confused glances, their eyes wide with surprise. "Did you feel that?" Luke whispered, rubbing his arms. Before anyone could answer, the classroom door swung open with a low creak that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Principal Henderson entered first, his usually jovial face wearing an expression of forced cheerfulness that didn't quite reach his eyes. Behind him came a woman unlike any teacher the students had ever seen. She was impossibly tall and pale, so pale that her skin seemed almost translucent in the fluorescent lighting. Her hair was long, dark, and straight, falling past her shoulders like a black waterfall. She wore a dark sweater and a long dress that seemed to belong to another era, both garments so deeply black they appeared to absorb the light around them. But it was the way she moved that truly unsettled the class. Her feet seemed to barely touch the ground, and she glided forward with an eerie smoothness, as if she were floating rather than walking. Principal Henderson cleared his throat, his voice overly bright. "Class, I have an announcement. Your regular teacher, Mrs. Martinez, has had some family matters she needs to attend to urgently. This is Ms. Vesper, and she'll be taking over for the remainder of the school year." The principal's eyes darted nervously to Ms. Vesper and then back to the class. "I'm sure you'll all give her the respect and attention she deserves. Ms. Vesper comes highly recommended, and I know you're in good hands." With that, he practically fled from the room, the door clicking shut behind him with an ominous finality. Miss Vesper stood at the front of the classroom, her dark eyes scanning the rows of students. When she finally spoke, her voice was flat and monotone, devoid of any warmth or inflection. "Good morning, class. I am Miss Vesper. In the time we have remaining, we will cover significant ground in algebra and prepare you adequately for 8th grade." She paused, her head tilting slightly to one side, in a movement that seemed almost mechanical. "I expect complete attention and absolute silence during my lessons." As she spoke, something strange happened. Her hair began to move ever so slightly, as if caught in a gentle breeze. But there was no breeze. The windows were closed, and the air in the classroom had become perfectly still. The dark strands swayed and rippled around her face, creating an hypnotic, unsettling effect. Ms. Vesper turned to the whiteboard and began writing algebraic equations with long, spidery fingers. Her handwriting was precise and angular, almost like ancient runes. As she continued her lesson, her voice droned on in that same lifeless monotone, explaining variables and coefficients with mechanical efficiency. Then, without warning, she stopped mid-sentence. Her head turned slowly, too slowly, and her eyes locked onto a boy sitting near the front of the class. His name was Mark Chen, a quiet student who kept mostly to himself. Ms. Vesper's gaze fixed on him, with an intensity that was almost physical, and for the rest of the lesson, she never looked away. Even as she continued speaking about equations and solutions, her dark eyes remained trained on Mark's face. Mark sat frozen in his seat, his hands gripping the edges of his desk until his knuckles turned white. The colour drained from his face as those unblinking eyes bored into him. Fear flickered across his features, raw, primal fear that made his classmates shift uncomfortably in their seats. He wanted to look away, wanted to hide, but found himself trapped in that terrible gaze like a rabbit caught in a predator's sights. When the bell finally rang, signalling the end of class, students practically stampeded toward the door. Mark was the first one out, nearly tripping over his backpack in his haste to escape. Later that afternoon, David, Matt, and Luke walked home together, their usual route taking them past the old riverside park and through the tree-lined streets of their neighborhood. The heat had returned with a vengeance, but none of them seemed to notice. "That was the freakiest thing I've ever seen," Matt said, kicking a stone along the sidewalk. "Did you see her eyes? It was like she was trying to hypnotize Mark or something." David nodded vigorously. "And the way she moved. My mum has this old horror movie with ghosts in it, and they move exactly like that. Like they're not really touching the ground." Luke shuddered despite the heat. "What about that cold wind? It was like 90 degrees outside, and suddenly it was freezing in there. That's not normal." "Nothing about her is normal," David agreed. "Did you notice she didn't blink? Not even once during the entire lesson. I was watching." They continued discussing their strange new teacher until they reached the intersection where they usually parted ways, each heading to their respective homes. But the unease they felt didn't dissipate with distance. It followed them home, settled into their thoughts, and made the evening feel longer and darker than usual. The next morning, Luke arrived at school early, eager to compare notes with his friends about Miss Vesper. As students filtered into the classroom, he kept glancing at the door, waiting for David and Matt. When they finally arrived, breathless from running up the stairs, Luke immediately pulled them aside. "Have you guys seen Mark?" he asked quietly. David and Matt looked around the classroom. Mark's desk sat empty, his chair pushed in neatly. They scanned the hallways through the open door, but there was no sign of him. "Maybe he's sick," Matt suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Or maybe he's just late," David added, though he didn't sound convinced either. Before they could discuss it further, that same unnatural chill swept through the room. Every student fell silent, their breath visible in tiny clouds of condensation. The temperature had plummeted again, and this time, the cold seemed to seep into their bones. The classroom door opened, and Ms. Vesper glided in, moving with that same disturbing smoothness. She wore the exact same outfit as the day before. The same dark sweater, the same long black dress. Not similar clothes, but the exact same ones, as if she had never taken them off. The three boys exchanged significant glances. What kind of teacher wore the same clothes 2 days in a row? Ms. Vesper moved to her desk without acknowledging the class, her feet seeming to hover just slightly above the floor. She arranged some papers with methodical precision, then turned to face the students with that same blank, expressionless face. In the back of the classroom, 2 girls named Sherry Miller and Lynn Davidson were engaged in a heated argument, their voices rising above the nervous silence. "I saw it first," Sherry hissed, clutching a $5 bill in her fist. "I was walking right next to it when you pointed it out." "But I'm the one who saw it," Lynn shot back, reaching for the money. "Finders keepers, Sherry. Give it back." "You didn't find it. You just spotted it. I picked it up, so it's mine." The argument escalated quickly. Sherry's face flushed red with anger, and before anyone could intervene, she shoved Lynn hard. Lynn tumbled backward off her chair, landing on the floor with a painful thump. She immediately burst into tears, clutching her elbow where it had struck the ground. The temperature in the room dropped even further. Frost began to form on the windows. Ms. Vesper's head snapped toward the commotion with inhuman speed, her neck rotating at an angle that made several students gasp. Her face, previously expressionless, contorted into something terrible, fury mixed with something darker, something ancient and hungry. When she spoke, her voice was no longer monotone. It had changed into something guttural and savage, almost a growl that seemed to come from deep within her chest. Silence. The word reverberated through the classroom like a physical force. Students cringed in their seats, some covering their ears. Ms. Vesper began moving toward Sherry, but she wasn't walking. She was hovering, her feet at least 3 inches off the ground now. The movement was smooth and terrifying, like watching a ghost drift through a graveyard. Her hair whipped around her face, despite the complete stillness of the air, and her eyes had changed, becoming darker and more bottomless, like staring into an abyss. "You dare disturb my classroom with such petty violence," Ms. Vesper's voice continued to growl, each word dripping with venom. "You dare harm another student in my presence." Sherry had gone completely white, frozen in her seat, unable even to tremble. Ms. Vesper reached Lynn, who was still crying on the floor. With movements that were suddenly gentle, disturbingly so, she helped the girl to her feet. Her long, cold fingers brushed Lynn's hair away from her face, and for just a moment, something passed between them. Lynn's crying stopped abruptly, and her eyes went slightly glassy. There, child," Ms. Vesper murmured, her voice returning to its flat monotone. "You are safe. Now." Then she turned back to Sherry, and the fury returned. "You. Principal's office. Now. And you will remain there until I determine your punishment is complete." Sherry scrambled from her seat, grabbed her backpack with shaking hands, and ran from the room. The door slammed behind her with such force that several students jumped. Ms. Vesper returned to the front of the classroom, her movements once again smooth and ethereal. She picked up a piece of chalk and began writing on the board as if nothing had happened. But the boys noticed that she held an envelope in her other hand, clutching it with long fingers that seemed to have too many joints. Luke's desk was positioned near the front, and as Miss Vesper passed by, the envelope came close enough for him to read the address written in elaborate cursive script. Ms. Vesper, 1847, Blackwood Lane. Luke's breath caught in his throat. He knew that address. Blackwood Lane was an old street on the edge of town, lined with decrepit houses that dated back to the early 1900s. It was the kind of neighbourhood where people didn't walk after dark, where streetlights seemed dimmer and shadows stretched longer. The rest of the morning passed in a haze of anxiety. Miss Vesper continued her algebra lesson in that same droning voice, but none of the students could concentrate. They kept glancing at Mark's empty desk and at the door Sherry had fled through, wondering what was happening. When lunch finally arrived, Sherry didn't appear in the cafeteria. Neither did Lynn, who had gone to the nurse's office and apparently never returned. The absence of 3 students in one day felt ominous, like pieces disappearing from a puzzle. After lunch, when the class reluctantly filed back into room 214, Ms. Vesper made an announcement. "I have been informed that Sherry Miller has been suspended for her violent actions. She will serve her suspension in the principal's office for the remainder of the week, where she can contemplate the consequences of harming others. As she spoke, she tapped that same envelope against her desk, the sound sharp and rhythmic in the quiet classroom. Luke stared at it. The address burned into his memory. 1847 Blackwood Lane. Something was very, very wrong. That afternoon, the three boys gathered at Luke's house, a modest two-story home with a basement game room that served as their unofficial headquarters. Luke's parents were both at work, leaving the boys alone with their thoughts and their fears. They sat in front of the television, Nintendo controllers in hand, but the game on screen went unplayed. The colourful sprites jumped and ran across the screen, but none of them were paying attention. Mark wasn't at school today, David finally said, breaking the silence. He was fine yesterday. Scared, but fine. And now he's just gone. And Sherry, Matt added. Suspended in the principal's office. That doesn't even make sense. When kids get suspended, they get sent home, not kept at school. Luke set down his controller and turned to face his friends, his expression serious. Guys, I need to tell you something. I saw the address on that envelope Ms. Vesper was holding. 1847 Blackwood Lane. So, Matt shrugged. That's probably just where she lives. That's exactly my point, Luke said, his voice rising with excitement, or maybe fear. I know that street. My dad took me past it once when we were looking at houses before we moved here. He said those houses have been abandoned for decades, that nobody lives there anymore. The whole street is falling apart. David leaned forward, interested despite his apprehension. What are you saying? I'm saying something weird is going on, and it has to do with Ms. Vesper. Mark stares at her funny, and the next day he doesn't show up. Sherry pushes Lynn, and suddenly they're both gone too. And Ms. Vesper lives in an abandoned house on the creepiest street in town. Luke stood up, pacing the room. I think we should go check it out. Check what out? Matt asked, though he already knew the answer. Her house. We should ride our bikes past there and see if anything looks weird. Are you crazy? Matt's voice shot up an octave. That's stalking. That's like illegal or something. It's not stalking if we're just riding past on a public street, Luke argued. We'll just look, that's all. If we see anything strange, we go to the cops. If we don't, we come home and play Nintendo. Easy. David nodded slowly. I think Luke's right. Something isn't adding up. And if we can figure out what's going on before anyone else gets hurt... You guys are insane, Matt protested, crossing his arms. This is how people in horror movies die. They go poking around where they shouldn't, and then boom, they're dead. Come on, Matt, David said with a sly grin. Don't tell me you're chicken. I'm not chicken, Matt shot back defensively. I'm being smart. There's a difference between being scared and being stupid. Bark, 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 David made chicken noises, flapping his arms. That's real mature, David, Matt said, but his resistance was crumbling. Pride warred with self-preservation in his expression. Fine, fine, I'll go. But if we die, I'm haunting both of you. Deal, Luke said, already heading for the garage where their bikes were stored. The bike ride to Blackwood Lane took about 10 minutes, leading them through the nicer parts of town and gradually into older, more run-down neighbourhoods. The houses grew shabbier, the lawns more overgrown, and the trees taller and more gnarled. By the time they reached Blackwood Lane, the sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. The street lived up to its reputation. Most of the houses looked like they hadn't been occupied in years. Broken windows stared out like empty eyes, Sagging porches groaned under the weight of rot and neglect, and ivy had claimed entire facades, turning the homes into green vegetative tombs. "Which one is 1847?" David whispered, though there was no one around to hear them. Luke checked the numbers on the nearest mailbox, doing the math in his head. "Should be there." He pointed to a house halfway down the block. Unlike its neighbours, this house showed some signs of occupancy, or at least less decay. The lawn was overgrown but not completely wild, and dark curtains hung in the windows, blocking any view inside. The house itself was a Victorian-style structure. All sharp angles and weathered wood painted a colour that might once have been white, but had long since faded to a dirty grey. The boys wheeled their bikes across the street and stood on the opposite sidewalk, staring at the house. For several minutes, nothing happened. The house sat silent and still, giving no indication that anyone lived there. "See?" Matt said, trying to sound confident. "There's nothing here. It's just a creepy old house. Can we go now?" "Wait," David said, holding up a hand. "Did you hear that?" They all fell silent, straining their ears. At first, Luke heard nothing but the distant sound of traffic and the rustle of leaves in the wind. But then, faintly, he caught it. A low humming sound, like chanting, coming from somewhere inside the house. "Okay, that's creepy," Matt admitted, "but it still doesn't prove anything. Maybe she's just religious or something. Maybe she's praying." At 4 p.m. on a Tuesday, Luke asked skeptically. As they argued, David suddenly grabbed both of their arms. "Did you see that?" "See what?" Luke asked. "There, in the basement window. A flash of light." They all stared at the small window set low in the foundation. For a moment, nothing happened. Then another flash. Bright white light that illuminated the grimy glass for just a split second before vanishing. "Okay, I saw that too," Matt admitted, his voice shaking slightly. Another flash, brighter this time, and another. The flashes were coming at regular intervals now, like someone was taking photographs or using a strobe light in the basement. "We need to get closer," David said, already moving toward the house. "Are you nuts?" Matt hissed, but he followed anyway, with Luke right behind them. They crept across the street and approached the house from the side, moving as quietly as possible through the overgrown grass. The basement window was old and filthy, covered with decades of grime and dust. The wood frame had rotted in places, and one corner had separated from the foundation, leaving a small gap. The three boys crouched down beside the window and peered inside. What they saw would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Stay tuned until next week for the exciting conclusion.